Hello and welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap. Today we'll be exploring the language of science and medicine and the story behind a word. Scientific and medical jargon can be a bit abstruse and forbidding, to say the least, but I hope that by understanding the etymology and story contained within each word, we can all understand and appreciate the beauty of the language in use all around us. In this episode, we'll be exploring the word Syringomyelia. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, so let's dive right in. Etymologically, Syringomyelia is derived from the Greek prefix syrinx, or syring, meaning tube or channel. Think syringe, which has the same etymological origin. It's also derived from the modern Latin suffix myle, which hails from the Greek muelos, meaning marrow. So you put these two together and you get a word that means tube in the marrow. More generally, though, a syrinx is a fluid-filled cyst contained in the nervous system, and it usually pops up in two main areas: the spinal cord, in which case it would be called a syringomyelia, and the brainstem, in which case it would be called a syringobulbia. Now, according to Merriam-Webster, the first known use of the word syringomyelia was in 1880. However, a 2012 paper by Olivier Walusinski that was published in the journal Vesalius seems to indicate that the term was actually coined somewhere in the late 1820s to 1830s by a man named Charles Prosper Olivier d'Angers. Charles was a bit of an interesting person. He has an interesting backstory, so unsure of what exactly he wanted to pursue for his career. Like many 17-year-olds, he enrolled in the French military school, and he became an exceptional officer in Napoleon's Young Guard, and even fought in the Battle of Waterloo. Now, if it weren't for the unfortunate fate of the French at that battle, we may never have had the word Syringomyelia, because the loss allowed the royalists to reclaim power, ultimately leading to Charles seeing his way out of the armed forces and turning to the medical sciences. Now, he was quite a precocious young medical scientist, because at the ripe young age of 27, he penned his medical thesis entitled Essai sur l'anatomie et les vices de conformation de la moelle épinière chez l'homme. A bit of a mouthful, but it roughly translates to Essay on the Anatomy and Conformation Defects of the Spinal Cord in Man. Now, what's truly astonishing is that without the use of a microscope, and of course, if he has no microscope, there's no X-ray or ultrasound or MRI or anything like that, he was able to study and formulate the anatomy, physiology, and pathology of the spinal cord. And his magnum opus, published, the first edition published just 1 year later, entitled De la moelle épinière et de ses maladies, translates roughly to On the Spinal Cord and Its Diseases. In its third publication, we find the word, or the establishment of the word in the current use we understand it. And that was in 1837. More generally, a syrinx, the prefix of the word, a syrinx is a cavity formation in the spinal cord. And this was actually recognized by a medical professional way back in 1545. He was a pupil of the great Jacobus Sylvius, the individual was named, the pupil was Carolus Stephanus. He's also known as Charles Estienne. I think we can see why Carolus Stephanus was preferred. These are very interesting Latin-seeming names. Jacobus Silvius, Carolus Stephanus, lots of us's. But yeah, way back in 1545, this pupil of Jacobus Silvius was noticed this phenomenon of a cavity formation in the spinal cord. But for the word Syringomyelia, we have solely Charles Prosper to thank for such a lyrical and beautiful word to describe an unfortunately not so beautiful neurological condition. Now, the initial symptoms of this condition include pain, numbness in the hands due to sensory loss, stiffness of the legs, vertigo, dysphonia, or difficulty in speaking, among many others. Syringomyelia, the word, is still used today in order to indicate damage to the spinal cord due to the presence of abnormal fluid-filled cavities. The disorder became more commonly known when a clinical depiction of this condition was first described in Germany by two physicians and scientists known as Otto von Kahle and Friedrich Schulz in 1882. Now, after that, it was outlined in relation to a phenomenon known as a Arnold-Chiari malformation, and that was by John Cleland in 1883. And ultimately, these developments led to Abbey and Coley performing a myelotomy to drain a syrinx cavity in the spinal cord of a patient for the first time to complete the first neurosurgical rectification of the Syringomyelia condition. Okay, so now we understand that Syringomyelia is this condition characterized by this fluid-filled cyst or cavity known as a syrinx that forms within the spinal cord, maybe sometimes in the cerebellum. So we understand it's this chronic condition and it results in these symptoms, these unfortunate symptoms of pain and muscle weakness and numbness, decreased sensation. But what causes it? Where does this come from? Well, that's an interesting question as well. There's different types of Syringomyelia. There's congenital Syringomyelia, which results from, as was mentioned before, certain deformations or malformations. One of them is commonly known as an Arnold-Chiari malformation in the nervous system, but it can also result from acute traumatic events in an individual's life. So it can come much after birth. And actually, in some patients, the underlying cause can be idiopathic, otherwise meaning unknown what the cause is. The underlying cause can't really be identified. So I've mentioned this interesting term Arnold-Chiari malformation a couple times. It might be useful to briefly explain what that is. It's a bit of a fancy eponymous way of describing a neuroanatomical malformation. It's a condition in which there is a congenital defect in the nervous system in which the brain tissue actually extends into the spinal canal. And it mainly occurs when, part of the base of the skull, in the back of your head is misshapen or smaller than it would typically be. Okay, well, I think that'll cover it for today's episode. I wanted to keep it kind of brief and just do a quick dive into a word and briefly describe it and its history. So I hope you've enjoyed the episode. To recap, we talked today about a neurological condition in which a fluid-filled cyst, typically the cyst is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, it forms in the spinal cord, sometimes in the cerebellum. It's often the result of congenital neuroanatomical defects, often at the base of the skull, One of the common causes is an Arnold-Chiari malformation, and it results in unfortunate neurological symptoms, including weakness, pain, decreased sensation, scoliosis, vertigo, many other things, unfortunately. And we explored the interesting history of the word and the gentleman who coined the term, Charles Prosper Olivier d'Angers, and his interest, a brief description of his background and how he came to coin this term. So I hope you've enjoyed the episode, my friends, and until next time, stay safe and be well.